Great, thank you. Thanks for the invite. It's been really good to be here. And it's been good to be in touch with CND. And I've been lucky enough to do a few of these talks now with CND around the country. So I was at the Edinburgh CND conference a month or so ago, which was great to hear sort of all of the work that's been going on around sort of like Faslane and the peace camp and the protests outside the Navy base there. So I'm just going to, I think we're both going to talk for about 10 minutes and then maybe respond to what we've said and then have questions and comments and sort of hopefully just open it up and have a nice discussion about sort of some of the issues that have brought us here tonight. For me, sort of coming to this point of writing a book, like my first novel, not my second book, but my first novel, about the issues of sort of nuclear energy, nuclear power, nuclear weapons, was a long journey. And I don't know, I mean, you know, as a child of sort of like the 70s and 80s, I remember my first awareness of death and my first fear of death was nuclear annihilation. You know, and I remember that's being very prevalent for many people in the time, and probably more so for those who grew up in the 50s and 60s, even more so. And it's been a really interesting thread sort of through my life, and sometimes it's been very sort of like fortuitous. I remember sitting next to a Greenpeace campaigner who'd just been arrested campaigning outside the G8 when it was in France somewhere actually, and I just happened to sit next to him on a coach between London and Cardiff and sort of started up that conversation through to sort of more critical and targeted work around sort of campaigning and activism. So I worked for a long time as an environmental sort of writer, campaigner around using media to sort of raise awareness or sort of environmental issues and then broader sort of issues around poverty and gender, etc., particularly sort of like the Balkans and Southern Africa, and I now teach journalism and creative writing. And the story for me came about, I guess it was about 2015, coming up to the anniversary of Chernobyl, the 30th anniversary of the Chernobyl disaster, realising that I'd been working in environmental writing, but didn't really know that much about Chernobyl, wanted to start exploring it, and bought the book Chernobyl Prayer by Svetlana Alexievich. I don't know how many of you have read it. Yeah, I don't know if you agree, but I think it's a book that all humanity should read because of just the sheer tragedy and the hubris that it encounters in that book. And obviously, it won the Nobel Prize for Literature. It was Svetlana Alexievich created a new genre of writing in terms of the oral histories that story communicated. And I was so taken with the story, and that it just so happened to chime with things that were going on in my life at the time, of stories that I wanted to tell, that I knew that I wanted to write a book about it. But I having a conversation with Rob earlier about sort of like I don't know how many of you are creative writers, but the feeling of sheer indulgence that comes with sort of doing something creative when you're also a campaigner and you know you should be out in the world being active and protesting. And so for me, I ended up writing the book with two timelines, which was a present day timeline. Really, a present day timeline was a protest against Trident and Trident renewal, and the sheer obvious stupidity of it and the sheer waste of money that Trident represents and the horror that it represents. And so I wanted to, what I did was try to use the historical tragedy that has happened around Chernobyl and actually pair it with the potential tragedy that is and could happen around Trident and nuclear war and nuclear weaponry. And so in a way it was using the freight and the gravity of what is mankind. I will say mankind because it was man's hubris rather than woman's hubris that brought about sort of Chernobyl. So it was mankind's greatest environmental disaster that we know about. Just out of interest, I'm sure many of you remember Chernobyl when it happened and how it happened. Do you know how much of the radiation that could have escaped actually did escape? Any guesses? Yeah, less. 3 to 4% of the radiation that could have escaped if it had all gone up actually escaped. And so 3 to 4% of radiation from that disaster affected officially how many people?
Officially it was a few dozen or something.
Officially it's 39 people. Yeah, and unofficially up to 750,000 and probably more. You know, there are still children being brought over by wonderful charities such as the Chernobyl Children's International Charity, Chernobyl International, who are looking after, you know, children who have been born and grow up in Belarus with particularly heart abnormalities from the areas surrounding Chernobyl, even though it's now become a little bit of a weird tourist site that people go into and taking selfies, very much off the back of the incredibly successful TV programme that has raised the consciousness of Chernobyl in people's minds. So, you know, the disaster was incredibly real, and it's something that I'm really glad that the TV, I'm glad that the TV programme came out to give my book a little bit of a boost, which was quite nice. I didn't realise that was going to happen. But I'm really glad it sort of came out and actually was able to share the story of something incredibly hubristic and human-made. And bring those attentions of the issues of nuclear back into public attention, because, as I'm sure you know, many of you in the room will be activists. I know, you know, the issue of trident renewal is kicked down the road somewhere that so few people are thinking about, and yet underneath, you know, the government and the Navy are progressing along, tip-tapping along with payments here, work there, developing sort of like, you know, making trident renewal almost inevitable. And that for me is horrific, and it's an incredible waste of sort of our resources and our human ingenuity for what we could do with that money, what we could do with that sort of engagement with the world. So that's why I came to write. That's why I wrote the book, and it's sort of hopefully, I mean, those of you who've read it, I hope it works as a novel as well. It's an interesting book. The other thing that's made me think about, you know, wanting to come and share the story in spaces like this with you is not so much that, hey, I've written a novel, please buy it, it's really good. Oh, by the way, it's on a pay-as-you-feel basis tonight. So if you think what I'm saying is good, give a tenner. If you think what I'm saying is like rubbish, give like, but you still want to read it, give like 70p. It's fine. Yeah. And obviously, and all that money is going to Edinburgh CND for their fundraising as well. So please support them and take home a book. The thing that I've actually been thinking about since the book's come out, since I've been doing talks and meeting people who are actively campaigning and have been spending a lot of time thinking about this work and campaigning about it, is about the power of like creativity and storytelling in campaigning. And there are two sides of that, and that's really sort of like, I guess, the take home of what I want to talk about this evening is about, you know, there's a real opportunity for bringing in creative people, whether that be filmmakers, documentary makers, writers, artists, into the campaigning space to reach people with your stories and with your issues that actually maybe sort of like other forms of campaigning don't reach. So, for example, bringing a novelist into this space of the World Justice Festival to talk about sort of nuclear issues and hearing some of that story. And so, when I finally finish, I'll read out a little bit of the book just to sort of give you a sense of that. So there's that part of it, but not everyone is a novelist, not everyone's a filmmaker. But it's really interesting, I think, when you know, campaigns do think about reaching out to work with creative people to get the stories engaging with people in ways that sort of like typical protests maybe don't. And there's nothing wrong with typical protests. I mean, I'm a protester. I'm working quite closely with Extinction Rebellion and Animal Rebellion down in London at the moment to organise like the 2 weeks of activities. So, you know, we're thinking about like, you know, the traditional forms of disruption and being there. So that's absolutely right to do. But the other part of it as well is about sort of the power of story, and I think that's where I sort of come from. In terms of being a writer, being someone who's sort of spent a lot of time over the last 3, 4, 5 years thinking about sort of like how you can communicate the truth of a subject, the emotional truth of a subject, so that it moves people emotionally to act, to change, to engage. And that's what I think is really, really important. And that's something I've learned by being a creative person in this protest activist space, is that if we can actually really think about sort of like the wording, the framing, the messaging, and use, and perhaps go down that line of like researching the social science of how emotions move people, how frames and particular language moves people in that way, that can be a really, really powerful tool in the sort of activist campaign toolbox. And something that I've certainly picked up and along the way, sort of like as I've come to work with and learn a bit more about sort of like CND and sort of like Stop the War campaigns, is about sort of the really quite incredible, strong messages that you do have, that when you work together and really have like dialogue, not just dialogue to share the thoughts and share like the need for process, but to actually really share the compelling emotional stories that move people. That's when I've seen change happen in the room, and that's something that I think is a real, important sort of takeaway sort of from having spent 3 or 4 years writing a story and thinking about how do I get people to really read this story, because it's a story, it's a novel, it's about change, it's about individuals coming up for a reckoning in their life and making a decision about whether they will or won't move through that moment. How can you take that out into the campaign space, the activist space? How can you take that out into your process and your marches? How do we actually engage people emotively so that they make a change or a decision to act and then act again and then to act again? And then how can you do that on the grand scale, on the social scale? So how can we get that message of, we don't want nuclear, we don't want Trident, as things that roll off people's tongue? How can you make it conversations around the dinner table? How can you make like a world without nuclear thinkable, so that when crisis happens and people are looking around for the next idea for how we organise our world and our social life, how do you then make that thing that was just thinkable the next inevitable thing? So what I think is really important is like the power of emotional story, whether that be through something like a novel or something like a documentary or investigative journalism, or even sort of like the songs that we sing at campaigns, the songs that we sing on marches. How are they working towards, strategically working towards a point of making sort of a non-nuclear world thinkable and then inevitable? So I think that's something that I've been keen to sort of think about, share with people, and then leave that with you, so hopefully we can have a conversation about that later. Would you like me to read a little bit from the book? Yes, please. Just read a little bit. And for the writers in the audience, so the people who really love fiction, I'll sort of, I think it's page 50 in this book, page 54, page 54, was, for the first 3 drafts of this book, the first page. And it went back and forth with the publisher, and this book actually got rejected by the publisher that it was now published by, but the second draft phase, and then I went away and rewrote it, and sort of then got to a point where actually they were going, oh yeah, no, it's all right, you've done enough work now, it's a decent enough book. But something was missing from it. And what was really interesting is I got some feedback, and actually I got feedback from a good friend of mine, a woman called Vicky Adams, who's actually the literature officer for Arts Council Scotland. And she gave me some feedback on the book, which was really useful, about sort of the fact that even in any book you can have secondary characters, but those secondary characters can't be two-dimensional. They still need to be three-dimensional. And one of the characters in the book, who was perhaps a bit two-dimensional in an earlier draft, was the sister of the protagonist. And the protagonist is the figure who works at Faz Lane. He's a radiation monitor on the base. There is a fictional, but based, and this is where the connection with Rob Edwards here comes in, a fictional nuclear incident at the base, but actually grounded in quite a lot of reality about sort of the mishaps and the sort of problems that have been at the base. And then the protagonist, Anthony, has to deal with whether he's going to be a whistleblower or not, and whether he's going to sort of toe the Navy line, or whether he's actually going to stand up for the things he believes in. It's just like, and the conceit in the story is that he is also a survivor of Chernobyl. He was brought over to the UK on the convoys that the Irish Catholic Church organised at the time, and he was raised as an orphan in the UK and grew up, and has never been able to shake off the shadow of Chernobyl. And that's really the story. It's about, will he actually find this, will he come to this reckoning point in his life, will he pass that test, or won't he? And a lot of that passing of his test is actually about his relationship with the family who were left behind. And I think hopefully that's what resonates with a lot of people. So the family who was left behind was his sister, and his sister is a really important character in this book, and literally at the 11th hour before this book went to publication, I sat down and wrote by longhand a letter from the sister to the brother, trying to work out sort of what she would want to say to him. And that letter has ended up being pretty much verbatim as I wrote it, going into different parts of the book. And all of a sudden, this secondary and previously two-dimensional character hopefully has come to life. So I'm just going to start with the new beginning, which is a letter from her to her brother, who she's not seen for 30 years. Brother, it's your sister wishing you happy Independence Day, and by the time this letter reaches you, your birthday. They celebrate here with all the usual drinking and fighting. And you? Oh, I'm only teasing. The old people complain that we're always joking. I don't think that's true. I wish it was. I need to laugh. Because I'm sick. It's non-stop. But I celebrate our independence, as you may still do. Even so, we're not so independent, are we? At least, you remain part of my story. My husband doesn't want me to write to you. Yet here I am, writing. What do I risk for this? Tonight, I've cooked his dinner, and now he's sleeping on the sofa. Not like our father used to. Not like that. My husband is a good man. This is what all wives say, isn't it? Perhaps to admit our husbands are no good is to take the blame for our choices when they go wrong. I know 2 girls from the hospital who whisper in my ear that our husbands aren't satisfying, but what can they do? We meet for coffee at the sweet place on Tarashevchenko Boulevard near the hospital. What's its name? I can't remember. Large slabs of poppy seed cake, our eyes too big for our stomachs. The cream makes me feel sick. Don't drink the milk. That's what they said, isn't it? The politicians who came on television and said, don't believe the foreigners, the milk was fine, but it never tasted the same after, did it? I don't fear my husband. I cooked tonight a stew and he appreciated it. He's a good man, regardless of what you might think, when I tell you he pleaded with me to stop writing to you. But can you blame him? I've told him all I have to tell. He sees what I could not, what father never did, what perhaps our mother knew but would not admit. That you were the wolf brother. How does it feel to hear this? Some think my husband Drago is possessive and controlling. If he found out I was writing to you, would he strike me? Would he let his anger brew like the buha in the shed? Would he burn 1,000 holes into my skin? He wouldn't have married me if that was his temperament. He says I'm a survivor. He married me knowing the scars on my body and the withering of my breasts. Perhaps a sister should not share this information with her brother, but my breasts will never produce milk. They hang over my ribs like the empty sacks we used to take into the forest. My husband makes love to me despite this, or perhaps because of this. There is pity in his love, but can not love be this mix of pity and compassion? Even if love makes for a shorter life, and the doctor's medicine's a longer one, I will take his love over their prescriptions. It's not the length of the life that matters. We walk together along the Dnieper to the city, and he encourages me to meet the other girls, to keep my ties to the privileges. And I cry with the nausea of knowing that at least I have survived long enough for love. And you, brother? Does your wife make you feel like this? Do you fight alongside her for what is important? Did she tell you to write to me, or not to write to me? It wouldn't matter. What matters is that she stands beside you. This is what I have with my husband. It's why I'm able to write to you, even with him saying I should not. But he's wrong. Your life is full of the privileges that come with being a man, and I'm not writing to take those away from you, as if a woman could do that. But there are tales you should hear, but not the ones we heard as children, about the wolves and the foxes. There are other stories, and the ones that matter now, about our bodies and about our lives. You're a man and married. You understand a woman's body. And I'm not a sister anymore, but a frail thing, shivering in a harsh wind. You were caught by this wind too, but your sails faced the opposite direction, and you were blown away. But I'm no poet, forgive me. I've been happy these last few years, but there's misery too. I'm too young for this body, for what happened to it. We were children, we didn't know, but we're not children now. Wisdom scares me. Does it scare you? Are you ready to hear what I have to say? I don't want to, my husband doesn't want me to. But if I don't tell you, I don't know how to live. I'm no poet, but I can at least write a letter. I must, you see. Without knowing what's happening to me, you will never know what's happened to you.